put my keys in your purse. Good afternoon. If everybody could please find a seat or stand if you prefer. Please bear with me, I've never done this before. We are sending a live feed to the family overseas that couldn't be with us today. This is the part where I forgot my name. My name is Tamar Geist. I'd like to thank you all for finding your way here today. Deep breath. Daniel would be severely unamused if we did not treat today as a joyous occasion. Keep that thought in the back of your minds. Today we gather to remember and celebrate the man named Daniel Ware. We will start with a poem written by Reverend Luther F. Beecher and read by Katie Guchik. Hello. Okay.
I'm standing upon the seashore. A ship at my side spreads her white sails to the moving breeze and starts for the blue ocean. She's an object of beauty and strength. I stand and watch her until at length she hangs like a speck of white cloud just where the sea and sky come to mingle with each other. Then, someone at my side says, "There, she is gone." Gone where? Gone from my sight, that is all. She is just as large in mast, hull, and spar as she was when she left my side. And she is just as able to bear her load of living freight to her destined port. Her diminished size is in me, not in her. And just at the moment when someone says, "There, she is gone," there are other eyes watching her coming and other voices ready to take up the glad shout, "Here she comes!" And that is dying.
Thank you, Katie. This poem was said at Daniel's Uncle Don's funeral, and it seemed fitting to be read here today. Daniel was a friend and colleague of mine for the past 10 years. I was first introduced to him as the invisible husband. Lynn started working at PCPA in 2012, but her English husband was off touring with something called Tap Dogs. No one quite believed her until about 6 months later, when Dan suddenly appeared. Soon after, the names Lynn and Dan became synonymous. Chili, bad movie nights, and wine tastings became a staple activity amongst our friends group, as did discussions about books, life, and of course, theater. Too many stories. Moving on. We would like to thank UNLV for hosting us here today. Daniel appreciated being able to always have an open conversation with Michael Lugering. It is a fact that whenever they had a conversation, Daniel felt heard at the end of the day. I would like to invite Michael, the interim chair of the Department of Theater, to say a few words about Daniel.
I appreciate that because my mother would have reminded me not to talk about myself. So it's good. You know, I wasn't Daniel's closest colleague. I mean, he has people that he interacted with every day and close, but he was I think we just both grew, since I took over as the acting chair for this brief period of time, had wonderful conversations and trust and respect. And so we don't forget that we need to make time. One of the things we kept saying was, we're going to go to lunch. We didn't do that. So it's important, I think, to make the time to go to lunch, and that we're not too busy. So I will tell you my experiences with Daniel, and a little about how that interaction was so rewarding, I think, for both of us. You know, this event has great intersectionality, if you want to use a sort of current word. I mean, this affects the Department of Theater and the PAC. Yeah, it also, Lynn is an alumni of our department and a graduate, and Daniel has students that he taught, and Lynn has students that she came to school with. So I think we feel the loss in a large way from lots of groups, and it's important to see just how many people he touched. Daniel was intelligent, really intelligent. He went to Skidmore, and I so appreciated that, because I think he could both, there was a logic and a practice that melded in a beautiful way. When I first talked with him, he said, well, I suppose, we talked for like an hour, and he said, well, I was just told that I needed to do everything on time and under budget. And I said, okay, that sounds like maybe how this is supposed to go. But he said, you know, there's this other thing about teaching, and this one thing that we don't really want to mention, research. And all of those things go on in his shop. You know, he was able to get us this saw that's the size of a pool table that has a computer and tells where to cut. You know, it doesn't do him any good to have it if he doesn't have time in his day to train the students to use it. And he very much fought for that. That's why I think he was one of the best scene shop supervisors an educational institution could have. And he recognized that part of what they do is technique out of necessity, meaning they can have craftsman skills and wood skills, but there's sometimes when an actor needs to ram his fist through a door and not hurt himself, that takes a kind of research and a kind of experimentation that often we didn't afford to them, you know, that the schedule is so pushed. So I think he was constantly looking at this job both as a practical scene shop foreman who did get every show in under budget and on time. And when I say under budget, he's within $20. Do you know? So some people think they're under budget when this show is 400 over and this show is 600 less, which is not really true. You know, somewhere there was a budgeting problem, but he was always just meticulous. He was a voice for the students. He respected how we could not abuse labor in this practice of theater making. And he was almost always in French. In a French play in Molière, they always have a character called the raisonneur, which we call the reasoner. I think in many ways he was our raisonneur. There is a kind of art speak where we say, dream big, imagine everything, you can create it, you know. And Daniel's job was to get it on time and under budget. And what I think he stressed was some of these limitations are really quite real, and that imagination is often sparked by saying these are the parameters with which we can create. And that is a hard role to play in a theater department or any professional theater, and a really, really valued role. He was, to me, kind of an old soul. And then I think, well, maybe that's just Daniel, but he understood that education wasn't just about drawing out, that it was also about putting in, or before you draw out, maybe you should put something in. He argued for accountability, when maybe we were accommodating, he had standards and integrity, and that influences every aspect of that shop. I think we have one of the safest shops anywhere, and I think that's important. Students don't often know what's safe and what's not safe. They're not a 30-year-old working professional. If they don't learn good safety standards here, whether they injure themselves here or somewhere else down the road, we have to thank him for that. I would very much like to see that the position that he's in be given clinical faculty status, because I think what he does, what Katrina does for us, is every bit as important. Running that shop, building those sets is every bit as important as what's going on in the dental lab at the dental school. These are clinical faculties with real, professional skills, running powerful equipment in an environment that can potentially quite dangerous. And he was great at that. I was speaking with Nancy yesterday and Lori, but there is a group of us here, and I don't know that we've ever had dinner together or breakfast or anything, that we are here and our spouse, our partner, is also here. And I made a list. There's Lynn and, of course, Daniel, Janice and Bill. There's Nate and Linda Lister. There's Lori Cobo and Ricardo, Alfredo in architecture, and Joanna in the Honors College, and newly Michelle, who's in the provost office, and Stuart from our department. And we were saying, it's nice having a faculty here, a faculty spouse here, and there's kind of a place where work is home and home is work, and public and private, become mixed and mingled. And I just think that can make this especially difficult for when you come to work and when you go home. There is an absence in both places, and I was just reflective of how hard that would be, and I appreciate the struggle. So I have another, simple thought that we will miss him, and the infrastructure in our shop is better than it's ever been, meaning he got stuff purchased, he got better equipment, so he leaves us in far better shape than what he inherited him. We will miss him. We got a van, we got a new truck, I just call it the van. It will come soon, and I will never see it that I don't think of Daniel, because the van he had is from what you were telling me, 1995. I had to take pictures of it. He needed a new van, and it's important to lobby for the things that you need when resources could always be devoted in other places. I think he was an advocate for all of that. I will miss him. We also this year in the Department of Theater lost another faculty member, Clarence Gilliard. So I think also, as we think on Daniel, we should remember Professor Gilliard and his contribution to our department, and we will miss them. We will miss them both. Thank you. Oh, I'm taking your script.
Don't take the script. You don't want me to wing this. Thank you, Michael. It would not be appropriate to celebrate Dan without being close to a theater where he spent most of his life. I would like to thank his students for being here. They will never know the special place each and every one of them held in his heart. He found his calling in teaching and his home here with all of you. When you got to know Daniel and he called you a friend, he also called you family. Daniel's father could not physically be with us today, but he is attending via our live stream. Daniel's brother Julian has prepared some words on the behalf of Roland, their father.
Obviously, Daniel's father, it's very sad that he can't be here with us today. And he has given me some words. These are his words. not ours. We haven't prepared them. It's a short statement just to reflect on the current situation. So I will just read it. The loss of a son is about the worst thing that can happen to a father. Dan was the only child of Sally and I. We took him to the US when he was 8. We came back after 22 years, but he decided to stay. He and Lynn have developed their careers in the theatre, in which they were very absorbed and happy. We spoke once or twice a week. I spoke to him only 2 evenings before his death. The coroner's verdict of natural causes is very difficult to take, as dying so young is the most unnatural thing to happen. I wish I could be there in person. If I was to pick 2 words to describe Dan, they would be warm and generous. I will be thinking about Lynn at this time.
Thank you. No matter how larger than life, full of wisdom and insight Daniel seemed, he was actually the youngest. Guy, would you please share a little bit about your baby brother?
Thank you. Yes. I'm Guy, and I was the baby for a while until Daniel came along. So you've just heard our father's words, and I want to speak on behalf of Julian, myself, Mark, his 3 brothers, Deborah, Daniel's sister, and our families, his kind of army of nephews and many, many nieces who collectively made up his tribe in England. So Daniel James Rowland, for those of you who don't know his full names, is our little brother, and he was born September 1977. His mother Sally's only child and our father's 5th. We lived in Cottenham, which is, I'm sure you all know, Cottenham is a small village just north of Cambridge, England, where there's no hills and it barely ever rains. Yeah, downtown Las Vegas, a bit less gambling, a lot more sugar beet. So I was already a teenager when Dan was born, and Sally, his mother, and our dad never let me forget the time they left me babysitting, and then came home to find me pushing his pram back and forth vigorously, blasting out The Clash as loud as it would go, and wondering why he wouldn't stop crying. No idea what it did for his musical taste, or indeed what his musical taste was, but I think it's probably a pretty good preparation for a life in the theatre. A few years on, then, picture, if you will, a small boy, even Daniel was small once, wearing shorts and welly boots, whatever the weather, and a hat, always a hat. He had a huge collection of hats. I don't quite know why, but he had a huge collection of hats, and no day would he leave the house before he'd chosen the most appropriate one for the event. So, fireman, check. Snowman, check. Scruffy old hunter, yeah, that'll do. And he had his pockets. He was a bit like William in this respect, for those of you old enough to remember just William. Always full of stones and shells and bits and bobs. And his belt was always stuffed full of sticks. Sticks every time. Even at Julian and Anne's wedding, he brought his sticks so that he could shoot the bride and groom throughout the ceremony, which he did. I don't think he was. I'm glad he got that out of his system before he moved to a country where that would probably get you shot. Dan was an avid reader and read at the most extraordinary rate. Personally, I think I'm reasonably well read. I read slowly at the speed of speech, and Dan read at the speed of light, and it was frankly terrifying. When he visited, he would pull a couple of books off my shelves of a night, just as I was getting ready to go to bed, and I'd think, will I see them again? But in the morning, he'd have finished them. There's an old Woody Allen joke about speed reading. which goes, he read War and Peace in 20 minutes, he said. It was about Russia. But with Dan, he'd read a 600-page novel in the back of a car on a relatively short journey, and then we'd grill him about, so what was it about, who was in it, what happened, and he would know. He had retained all that information, and I just have no idea how he did it. But it's a very useful skill. When he was 8, as we've already mentioned, Dan, Sally and Dad moved to Westwood, just outside Boston, Massachusetts. And we were really pleased to see the other day his friend Tom Cotilas from Westwood had written about him on Facebook and about his time, their time together there growing up, which appears to be endless games of Lego, Nintendo, Dungeons and Dragons. And apparently Dan introduced Tom to the concept of a cheese toastie. Didn't realise that was a foreign dish, but I gather there's a whole social media thing about British cuisine. There you go. Dan, of course, didn't stay small for long. Having quickly embraced the kind of American way of life, he delivered the Boston Globe all around the neighbourhood, and he threw himself into Scouts in particular, and he worked his way. He was a very enthusiastic and selfless Scout. I mean, one of the tenets of Scouting is you are there to serve other people, and Dan excelled at that, and he worked his way through to the highest level of Eagle Scout. He was also a fast and powerful swimmer, and worked as a lifeguard during the vacations, and frankly, can you get more all-American kid than that? And he also a strong skier. With her feet on his skis, he took his then 2-year-old niece, Ellie, for her first run up at Killington in Vermont, where my father used to get up before dawn and drive to be able to ski. After that, as has already been mentioned, he went to Skidmore, to Liberal Arts College in Saratoga Springs, where, possibly to his parents' slight consternation, he discovered his love of both theatre and more specifically of carpentry. It may have helped that his grandfather and uncle on his mother's side were both builders. I don't really know whether these things work that way. But it was quite clear that what Dan had found was a vocation. And not everybody is lucky enough to do that. And it sang out in the way that he worked, the way that he talked about his work. He knew what he wanted to do with his life, and he was bloody well going to do it. But before plunging into the theatre professionally, he also put those new construction skills to very good use, visiting Brazil to help the charity Habitat for Humanity, building houses for the homeless. He was a generous soul, and he knew he had a privileged position in life, and he always sought to help others, as I've mentioned, but in very practical ways. And I think there could be no clearer example of that than actually building people things. He loved to come to the UK when he could to catch up with his tribe, and particularly with his nephew and many, as I said, many nieces. Any walk in the countryside would wind up with Dan with a small child on each shoulder, and possibly even when those children were not so small. There is photographic evidence. But he himself grew up faster than made any sense to me. At least a foot taller and a couple of feet wider than any Ware had ever been before, I think. And then he met Lynn, and he was so proud to bring her on one of those trips to the UK to meet us all. So we, as a family, I personally couldn't make it, but many of us did, were delighted to be part of Dan and Lynn's wedding in 2011 and to be made so welcome by her family. It was very important. And a few years later, when his niece, one of his nieces, Charlotte, was marrying James, we had another wonderful family gathering. Then in 2018, so for almost 5 years ago, Dan and Lynn were there when we celebrated our father's 90th birthday which was a lovely family celebration. But as for so many, family celebrations got a bit interrupted by COVID, and long distances were not possible. So we were delighted that Lynn and Dan were able to represent our family at the wedding of another niece, Harriet, and Garrison in Los Angeles in 2021. The last time we saw Dan and Lynn in England was later that year when his mother suddenly and unexpectedly died. They were there as soon as conceivably could be. And I was reminded of how attentive and supported Dan had been several years earlier when Sally was undergoing successful treatment for breast cancer. And I'd like to thank Lynn, particularly in turn, for all the help and support she gave, not only to Dan, not only to her father, but to the rest of us when Sally died. So thank you. The last time we, his siblings, spoke to Dan was just a couple of weeks ago. He told us how pleased he was. He loved teaching, but he also loved getting his hands dirty. And after too long, he said, he was really happy about having got back in the shop to actually build some props for an upcoming show. And he was rightly proud of his craftsmanship. You will know, many of you will know a lot more about that than I do, but what I know is what he told me, and it shone from him when he talked about it. And then he sent us the pictures just to prove it. So Daniel, our little brother, uncle, great uncle, it's already been said, kind, generous, patient, amazing knowledge and practical skill, but not an ounce of ego. He's happy to help anyone, any time. The maker, a teacher, and so proud of his lovely wife and the life that they built together. There's a Seamus Heaney poem I'm not going to read about the death of a young brother as a child, but it ends when the poet, summoned home from school, sees the coffin, a 4-foot box, a foot for every year. Well, Dan was 45. His box is smaller even than that. He was my little brother, but he was a big man in many, many ways. And without him, the world feels just a little bit smaller. Thank you.
As we've heard, Daniel is one half of a love story, Lynn being the other half. None of us sitting here today can imagine one without the other. Lynn would like to tell you a little bit about the story of Dan and Lynn.
It's quite odd. Normally, I am the one that's here pre-show telling everyone how to talk into a microphone. I never come in for this portion of the show, but I guess this isn't a show, and this is life. So I'll just read from my script. I am sorry that we had to meet here today like this, but I am so proud that Daniel has touched so many lives. I first met Dan when I overhired at Trinity Repertory Theater in Providence, Rhode Island, October of 2002. I had taken a year off of school for my father's illness and passing, and found my world was missing the light of theater. Trinity had been the theater of my youth, and I was excited to actually work at a theater that had inspired me with its telling of A Christmas Carol, which they did every year, just so you know. Every year. I met the motley crew of carpenters and felt at home. When I finished working as added labor for A Christmas Carol, Daniel, ever so sly, handed me his number and said I should give him a call. I did not. I kept his number, but I knew that if I dated Dan, that it would become a serious romance, and I did not want that in my life. I wanted to be young, single, stupid, and date. 2 months later, I went to work at Trinity again, and I apologized to Daniel for not calling. He shrugged. This time, while working at Trinity, I found myself wondering why I had been so stupid. I did call Dan, and we made date plans for February 13th because we did not want to be cliche. So our first date was February 13th, 2002. After dating Dan for 6 months, I knew that we would get married. I did not let him know this. In fact, I told my diary and I told Dawn that he was the man I would marry. Little did I know that we would not actually get married for 8 years. But we did. During the time of our initial romance, we had all the conversations. The ideas he shared with me back then helped shape my decision of what we would do this day. Dan talked to me about, if he ever died, that he wanted to have a large party. Thank you. And he did not want to be dressed in a suit to merely be buried in the ground. He wanted to live on with the people he loved. We talked about how he would be cremated because it made the most sense. Daniel said that someone should stand up and make a toast while punch was being handed out. And after everyone takes a sip, the speaker shall then announce that Dan will now live on inside all of you. Yeah, with quizzical looks, it was then to be known that Dan was in the punch. And now everyone had a piece of him. Since this is gross, and probably against some laws, instead I decided we would hold a celebration of life and let Dan live on in our hearts and souls and leave his physical ashes to rest. The hard part. We balanced each other, and we would always help each other find their footing when unsure. And although there is so much to say about the man I love, and all the stories fill my memory, he was caring, smart, very well read, and always ready to get into a stupid discussion because he liked to take counterpoint. I will miss the quibbles we once had and the laughs we shared. He was my rock, and I know that life will not be the same without him, but I would not change any of it if it means forgetting him. Thank you.
I'm going to go a little off script for a hot second. Bear with me. I put together the slideshow of images of Dan earlier this week. And we all know that Dan was an avid reader, and he shared books with so many of us and stories with so many of us. I don't think there's a single picture of Dan with a book in his hand, which I find really surprising, and that this just dawned on me. And I thought you all should know. So that was my off script. I apologize. Like Lynn, we wouldn't be here today if we didn't hold our relationship with Dan in a special place in our hearts. Whether you knew Dan for a minute, a millennia, whether your interaction with him was a chapter or an entire novel, he had a way of staying with you, with all of us. I want to encourage you all to take some time this afternoon. Share your stories about him. Remember Dan with a laugh and a smile. He would not want us to remember him in sadness. He would want us to remember the joy he brought to all of our lives and us to his. Thank you all for being here. We're going to end with a poem by Mary Lee Hall, read by Daniel's sister, Deborah. After which, please, get a drink, eat some food, and tell a tale of the man named Dan, as he would want.
Turn Again to Life by Mary Lee Hall. Sorry. If I should die and leave you here a while, be not like the others, sore, undone, who keep long vigils by the silent dust and weep. For my sake, turn again to life and smile, nerving thy heart and trembling hand to do something to comfort weaker hearts than thine. Complete those dear unfinished tasks of mine. Sorry. And I, perchance, may therein comfort you.
As I said, please go drink.